Hello, everyone. This is Osama Rizvi from Primal Vision Network, and today we have with us the one and only Professor X, Mark Rossano. Finally, it's been a long time coming, Mark, and I have been wanting to speak with you on an unprecedented amount of topics. But today, I believe we're going to speak about what actually you cover a lot in your in our shows, econ show as well, the food side of the global economy, the food security, the food prices, and what's going on that front. So, just as a opening question, generally, where do we stand in terms of food security? If you can break it down in terms of the advanced economies and countries like where I am living right now, like Pakistan or Bangladesh or African countries, can you give us an overview about that?
Sure. And thanks for having me on and discussing some of these key topics. But one of the things that we've seen, and this is even pre-COVID coming into obviously what was exacerbated by COVID, was that we were seeing a bigger issue with food insecurity, but also caloric intake. And even if you're getting food, is it enough to actually sustain a meaningful life in terms of just longevity and just terms of quality of life in general? And one of the things that we had been seeing prior to COVID was this degradation where more and more people were what's called malnourished, undernourished, and just didn't have the caloric value that was really needed to sustain. Just think of it in terms of proper brain growth, proper acceleration, proper just your normal growing standards. And one of the problems that we've now seen when you talk about the developed versus emerging market, when you look at the developed world was doing okay. Things were, getting more expensive, but you could source enough materials, you could source enough food. And a lot of these developed markets could either feed themselves, export the excess, like, the United States, France, Canada, or you would have to import a significant amount. But they had the money to do so, whether you look at Japan, Australia, or New Zealand, just looking at some of the different bellwethers. But then you look at what's in between, and you can see that there's a lot of haves and have-nots. And it's really, who are your friends, who are your four trade partners. And one of the biggest things that has been shaken up, not only just with COVID, but now with Russia invading Ukraine, is this loss of a key material that was typically coming into a lot of these African nations and East Asia. So as that number dwindled, not only just from Russia, Ukraine, but then when you start looking at yields around the world. So one of the key pieces that we've seen are yields have been falling. Realistically, 2016 into 2018 saw a peak, and then you've seen degradation on yields across different crops. Like, they're not all at once. Some crops do better one year versus another, but there's a hierarchy. And one of the biggest problems right now is the shortfall that continues to expand, which just means that prices go up, and there's an increase in competition between these emerging markets, because the developed world is going to spend what they want, they're going to get what they need, and then whatever's left is going to go to this remaining field, which is getting very competitive and driving up prices in general, which is why you're starting to see countries that are running much closer towards, let's call it, the bottom of the silo than what they're used to, because they're trying to play the game as best they can to try to bring costs down to a point that is sustainable.
Yes, and speaking of that, this is a very good segue to speak about. Where do we see? So Russia and Ukraine war still goes on. The issue of fertilizers. There's a fertilizer crisis happening, as I would want you to tell people about that as well, because it isn't being covered by the mainstream media a lot. Only Bloomberg did a piece on that. But also in terms of the import restrictions, in terms of, I can see countries getting even, let's go ahead now, self-centered or more nationalistic in their approach. Is it because of, as you said, falling yields and lower stocks, or is it also some of the geopolitics that is going around?
It's a great question, and the answer is both. When you think about the most basic of Maslow's hierarchy, it's safety, food, and water. And if you want to stay in power, if you're in the government, you want to make sure that your people are fed. And the moment that stops, they're gonna lash out, and they're gonna come for whoever they think is going to be at fault. So when you look at people or countries that can feed themselves, they're going to put up what's called gates, or ways to minimize exports and make sure that there's more than enough that's going to stay in country to keep prices low, to make sure that, politically speaking, that they are going to stay where they are. You also are going to do it for the benefit of your own populace, to make sure that you're not going to get too much greed, where if you look at rice prices, whereas let's just say rice goes up to $1.50 a pound international, but it's 70 cents internal, well, you're going to go out and export as much, but they want to try to ensure that there's going to be enough for the local. So that's going to create that nationalistic, that push, but you also have to make it palatable. And so you have to go on a marketing campaign, and you have to just to try to drive that piece home, which then turns political, because that turns into the geopolitics of it all. Now, when you look at the haves and have-nots, that's where it's getting more and more stressed, because even some of the emerging markets that have been using the international world to increase some of their dollar intake, because a lot of these goods are moving on a dollar basis, they're getting restrictive, and that's creating more panic in other countries, which are turning to counterparts that are not overly friendly, or people that they normally don't buy from, or they have to go further into the market, which increases shipping cost, insurance rates, because they're coming, say, instead of importing soybeans locally or within the region, they have to go to Brazil or the US, which again is just going to increase that cost. And as we all know with supply chains, that cost gets passed down. So in the past, you had governments which would subsidize. Governments would make sure that they could put out, let's just say they'd keep rice or soybeans at a fixed rate, and then they'd pay the difference. But with COVID, with so much stimulus that got dumped into the market, you had a huge increase in debt. You have a huge increase in government deficits. So their ability to maintain that becomes a bigger problem. But you also have the issue of caloric value, and that's the malnourished, the nourishment side. And that's something that a lot of emerging markets, if you look at the UN, things that they've tried to go, it's not just get rid of hunger, but it's also increased nutritional value. And that's a big piece, because we're learning more and more about how important it is. Not to say that we always didn't know it was important, but it can come back to the forefront and making sure that there's a nutritional value. But that's hard to achieve if you're not bringing in things that have a lot of oils, or what's called, BRICS content, which has a lot of sugars and things of that nature, which is why, and then the last point is you touched on fertilizers. So the problem with synthetics, especially given some of the shortages, synthetics being used at such an aggressive ratio for so many years degrades the soil over time, because it has salts, it has clays, it has things that they use to bind the synthetics to, so that they can implement it. And over time that accumulates, and then the topsoil degrades to the point where you may be able to get the same size of the ear of corn, but the sugars and minerals and things that are normally in that ear of corn just don't have the same punch. And that's where you're starting to see that degrade. So even though some of these emerging markets are importing, the same tonnage, they're not getting the same calorie intake per ton. And that's one of those little complicated things that becomes a bigger issue. Now, when you start looking at China, which is gating some of their fertilizers because they want to bring down cost at home, then to your point on the complication with Ukraine and Russia, right there, Russia is a big exporter of potash. They're a big exporter of nitrogen, urea, and those are things that are not coming to market to the same level. So then you stress the other points where you would go to get that fertilizer. And again, that just drives up costs. So when you look at the farmer's facing higher rates because of deficits, because of central banks that are trying to get in front of inflation. So the farmer's facing higher interest rates, which then they're also facing higher seed costs. They're facing higher fertilizer costs. So net, they have to buy less quality just to try to plant their crop, which then is going to produce less yield. But because their costs are inherently higher, they have to charge more. And then because their yield is down, they have to charge above even that, because that cost is being spread across a smaller crop.
Okay, and you talked about soil health and all these things and yields, which brings me to, there was a recent book by George Monbiot who writes in the Guardian as well, by the name of Regenesis. That book had a lot of good points, a lot of seemingly controversial points, where he just asks everyone to stop farming animals, or stop eating meat, or something like that. But I mean, it has. The other domain, the solutions also have their extremities. But one thing I always think about is that, do you think, just thinking out loud, all these efforts towards carbon emissions, or efforts, or the narrative, carbon emission and climate change, we know climate change is a big driver of falling yields and food prices across the world. But do you think the efforts, monetarily, otherwise, they match the efforts being done, or some initiatives that are being done in order to help the world suffering from a food crisis? Or we are just fixated by these rhetorics and rosy outlooks and net zero emissions and whatnot?
So it's funny, and it's funny, but it's not at the same time, because when you look at the extremes that some of the environmentalist side have gone, they're being very myopic. So when you look at Europe, when you look at some of these areas that are talking about green and cutting emissions, it's like, okay, if you want to go organic and you want to do all these things, that's great, and you can afford to do that. But by doing so, you're going to reduce yields. You're going to reduce even things that are already coming under pressure, which is going to create a bigger shortfall. And one of the things, and you've probably heard me rant on this on multiple occasions, they're demanding change without providing a product to enable that. And I think that's the biggest issue in general, because it's like, okay, well, I want you to reduce emissions, therefore I want you to reduce the amount of diesel you're consuming. I want you to reduce the amount of nitrogen you're consuming, because I want to reduce your NO2, or nitrous oxide, which is 352 times worse in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. So you're like, okay, great. Happy to do it. What product should I use to reduce my nitrogen consumption? Oh, and then the government goes, I don't know. Like, what? Does that matter? And the farmer's like, well, you said you want me to reduce my nitrogen, but you're not giving me a product to reduce my nitrogen with. And you keep coming into this problematic situation where the goals are there, and they're achievable with the right product. And I think we have to get serious on addressing not only the environmental issue, which is a real issue, because by being poor stewards of the environment, we've destroyed our topsoil. We have seen a lot of leaching into groundwater, into our waterways. So there is a real need to get serious about it, but we have to be realistic on deriving what is environmental protection and then what is essentially suicide. And we have to look at the two to make sure that we're investing in the products and the methods to maintain yield and perform better in terms of just underlying yield.
Yes, and one of the things, to build on what you said, one of the things that these solutions or these outlooks they miss is the issue of scale. So we know that after COVID-19 and after Russia-Ukraine war, about 600 plus million people have become more vulnerable to hunger, right? They're not getting adequate food. So when we talk about reducing methane emissions, or, stop farming animals or anything, what are we thinking about these 600 or some million people, mostly in the developing part of the world? What are we? And also in terms of energy, Václav Smil, I tend to appreciate that man a lot. He, in his recent book, How the World Really Works, he has given this comparison that recently, in 3.1 billion people, about 40% of the global population still uses energy which is same to the amount of what Germany and France used to consume back in 1860s. So what do you mean when you say that we need to reduce our emissions? Are you saying this to them as well, the people who are using energy at the same level as people were using 200 years ago? So there's a bit of unnecessary generalization in terms of solutions when we talk about them. But yeah, moving on to the next question, there's always a political economy to everything. There's a political economy to energy transitions. There's a political economy to what should we think when we think about the geopolitics of, or the political economy of the food side of the global economy. Just like I didn't know this, but United States is the most important country when it comes to global agriculture and food products. I never knew that. It is one of the largest producers of so many agricultural products. So what should we, if we're going to research about it, what should we be considering?
So when you look at the U.S. and the U.S. is lucky in terms of the raw materials it has, the assets it has at its disposal, just because of the land mass and its location. But the biggest issue that we have now is that some of that has been sold off. Some of it has been sold to China, some of it has been sold to other ownership, which can do really whatever they want with it in a good and bad way. But the bigger issue that we're seeing is, and to your point, is some of these underlying flows, is the amount of product that is made available and where is it going. So when you talk about in terms of, what are some good things to look at, you have to look at the shipping data and understanding the supply chain. And there's been finally some really good books and articles and publications that have started looking at the supply chain, the issues that we've seen in terms of getting these products to different locations. One being just the Black Sea grain deal, trying to protect ships that are Ukrainian coming through the Black Sea and then through the Bosphorus Strait to make sure that it can get into the global market, because they'll take whatever we can possibly get. And our producer could second this. Russia also likes to overstate their grains on a regular basis. And they came in saying that they were expecting 100 million tons. Now it's down to about 73. And you have to get more realistic about, how do we understand the economy? How do we understand planting? And I think people are starting to wisen up about crop rotations, about what type of fertilizer is the right one. And those are things that we have to look at and get serious about. But we also have to appreciate of not being myopic, because you hear these things in some of these developed worlds, and then those in the emerging markets are like, what price? Like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't have the quality of life you have. I'd like that quality of life. I'm working towards that point, but you're trying to take stuff away from me without me ever being able to achieve. And I think that there's to be honest with you, a lot of investment opportunity, because you have a very educated populace. You have a supply chain rich populace in terms of raw materials, in terms of location geographically. And there are places that are going to be more friendly than others, which you can then come into and build up a fairly robust little economy within it. And I think that could create, to your point, of more microgrids and more regional grids, which then can be lumped and created and connected into something much larger. But you have to start small and then expand out from there. And I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity, especially as we get that nearshoring or that pivot where people are like, all right, everything doesn't have to be in China. And I'm not saying I'm closing everything in China, but I need diversification, and I need to be in other areas. And that provides opportunity to invest in the grid. If Samsung wants to move a facility, just using Pakistan for an example, if Samsung wants to move a facility there, a Samsung facility is going to require a lot of power. So I could come in, build either an LNG facility, some sort of natural gas capacity. This would then, they would then sign on, take 70% of the offtake, and that would leave me with 30% to sell into the local region, into the newer employees that would move there, into the knock-on effect to the economy, whether that be everything from dry cleaners on down to restaurants and to food stores and other types of stores that would then come from a growing populace. And this is the way we can do it smarter, because instead of me coming in and building a fuel oil facility, well, I'll come in and build an LNG facility. And because I'm an American company investing in a AAA rated or investment grade rated company, I can get LNG offtake that even the Pakistani government can't get. And now I'm starting to diversify that and take away the fears of corruption, the fears of the inability to source product, because you're starting to utilize the capital market to do so. And those are things that can be done around the world to help diversify and also create a cleaner atmosphere by reducing the need for coal and fuel oil and really relying more on natural gas, because it isn't a bridge fuel. It isn't an evil fuel. It is a pivotal fuel for the future.
Absolutely. we here in Pakistan are realizing this, given the paucity of supply and the shipment issues resulting as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war and all that. So that was it, guys. That was Mark discussing very interesting and insightful updates about the global food crisis and the food security. We will continue these interesting talks. Sorry for any technical glitches if there were any. And secondly, in the next episode, we would like to explore what is it with this all the de-dollarization campaign and all of these new keywords and new buzzwords in the news and in the opinion op-ed pieces. So we're going to explore, is it any truth to that, and what does it actually mean? What is the multipolar currency world order, if there is any, and other questions like that. I hope you enjoyed. That's all from this side, and we'll see you next week.